Nicholas Eymerich was a Roman Catholic theologian and Inquisitor General of the Inquisition of the Crown of Aragon in the later half of the 14th century. He is best known for authoring the Directorium Inquisitorum, Life, Education and Early Tenure as Inquisitor General. Nicholas Eymerich was born in Girona c. 1316. He entered the local monastery of the Dominican order on 4 August 1334. Here, during his novitiate he was instructed in theology by the Friar Dalmazumana. In order to complete his studies, he went to Toulouse, and then to Paris, where he obtained his doctorate in 1352. He then returned to the monastery in Girona where he replaced Mona as the teacher of theology. In 1357, Eymerich replaced Nicola Rosselli as the Inquisitor General of Aragon, as Rosselli had been raised to a cardinal. A year after obtaining the position, Eymerich was given the honorific chaplain of the Pope as a recognition of his diligence in pursuing heretics and blasphemers. However, the zeal he displayed as Inquisitor General earned him many enemies, as he directed much of his efforts to the apparent errors of members of the clergy. He often found his investigations blocked by the court, curia, or papacy. When Eymerich interrogated the Franciscan spiritualist Nicholas of Calabria, King Peter IV of Aragon had him removed from office at the General Chapter held at Perpignan in 1360. Eymerich was elected to be the Vicar General of the Dominicans in Aragon in 1362. However, this election was contested by one Father Bernardo Ermengardi who, in addition to having a long-standing dispute with Eymerich, was also politically backed by Peter IV. When called on to settle the matter, Pope Urban V invalidated Eymerich's election on the grounds that the office of Vicar General conflicted with the office of Inquisitor General. He did not, however, confirm Ermengardi in the position, opting for a neutral third Jacopo Dominici. For a time Peter IV prevented Eymerich from serving as Inquisitor. His hostility toward Eymerich intensified in 1366 when Eymerich began to attack the written works of Ramon Lull and to harass his followers, who were known as Lullists. The king forbade Eymerich to preach in the city of Barcelona. Eymerich disobeyed covertly and subsequently supported the revolt of the Diocese of Tarragona against the monarch. This conflict ended around 1376 when the local governor took 200 horsemen and encircled the Dominican monastery where Eymerich was residing. Eymerich fled to the papal court of Pope Gregory XI in Avignon. An example of Eymerich as Inquisitor General is his sentence of the Jewer-struck de Pera in 1370. De Pera was a native of Barcelona accused of sorcery. He was sentenced to publicly repent in a cathedral and then to life imprisonment. Eymerich ordered the piercing of heretics' tongues with a nail so they could not blaspheme. He was the first inquisitor to get around the Church's prohibition against torturing a subject twice by interpreting directive very liberally, permitting a separate instance of torture for a separate charge of heresy. First exile and return. While living in Avignon, Eymerich completed his most famous work, the Directorium Inquisitorum. In 1377, he accompanied Gregory XI to Rome, where he remained until the Pope's death in 1378. In the schism that erupted after the death of Pope Gregory XI, Eymerich sided with anti-Pope Clement VII, and so returned to Avignon late in 1378. While living in Avignon, Eymerich conflicted with Saint Vincent Ferrer, because Eymerich believed that Ferrer had begun to sympathize with Pope Urban VI, the Pope in opposition to Clement VII. Eymerich returned to Aragon in 1381, where he discovered that in his absence Bernardo Ermengardi had assumed the position of Inquisitor General. Eymerich refused to recognize Ermengardi in that office, and in 1383, acting as Inquisitor General, notified the inhabitants of Barcelona that he had banned the works of Ramon Llull. Furious, Peter IV ordered Eymerich to be drowned. However, the Queen Eleanor of Sicily influenced him to change the sentence to permanent exile. Once again, Eymerich ignored the sentence and remained in his native land, thanks largely to the support of Peter's son, John. King Peter IV died in 1386 and was succeeded by his son, John I, who recognized Eymerich's authority as Inquisitor General. At first, John I favored the repression of the Lullists, but this lasted only until 1388, when Eymerich decided to investigate the entire town of Valencia for heresy. King John I intervened to free the Chancellor of the University, who had been imprisoned, calling Eymerich a diabolicus fratrem. The king then forced him into exile again. Second exile and return. After the violence at Valencia, Eymerich sought shelter from John's reprisals in a church, but 2 years later, retreated again to Avignon, where he remained until the death of King John I. In Avignon, Eymerich devoted himself to the defense of the legitimacy of Clement VII as Pope. He remained in Avignon after the death of Clement VII in 1394, writing in support of Clement's successor, anti-Pope Benedict XIII. After King John's death in 1396, Eymerich returned to the Dominican monastery in Girona, where he remained until his death on 4 January 1399. His epitaph describes him as praedicator veridicus, inquisitor intrepidus, doctor egregius. Writings. The Directorium Inquisitorum. Eymerich's most prominent and enduring work was the Directorium Inquisitorum, which he had composed as early as 1376. It defined witchcraft, and described means for discovering witches. In compiling the book, Eymerich used many of the magic texts he had previously confiscated from accused sorcerers. The Directorium Inquisitorum was to become the definitive handbook of procedure for the Spanish Inquisition until into the 17th century. It can also be considered as an assessment of a century-and-a-half of official Inquisition in the conquered Albigensian country. Other works. Although the Directorium Inquisitorum was Eymerich's only book-length work, he wrote numerous tracts and papers on various theological and philosophical subjects. A good deal of Eymerich's life and writings were taken with opposing the writings of Ramon Llull. Owing to Eymerich's work, Pope Gregory XI banned several of Llull's writings and issued a papal decree against some postulates derived from his works. He would later dedicate his Tractatus contra Doctrinam Raimundi Lulli to Clement VII. In this document he indicated 135 heresies and 38 errors in the Lullists' theology. His Dialogus contra Lullistas is another example of his anti-Lullist works. Eymerich also wrote numerous works, including his Tractatus de Potestate Papali defending the legitimacy of the Avignon popes, Clement VII and Benedict XIII. Variant spellings of Eymerich's name. There appears to be very little scholarly consensus on the spelling of Eymerich's name. Nicolau Eymerich is the correct form of his name in medieval Catalan language spelling, and the most used form in Catalan, although nowadays it would be spelled Eymerich. Eymerich, or Eymerich, is still a common Catalan surname, and Nicolau is the Catalan spelling for Nicholas. The Spanish spelling, Nicholas, is also occasionally used. The title page of the 1578 impression of the Directorium Inquisitorum, which is printed in Latin, gives his name as Nicolae Eymerici. The most common ways his name is spelled in English writing on the subject is Nicholas Eymerich, with the spelling Eymerich being a close second. Occasionally, the Spanish form of Nicholas is used in English writings as well. Other, less common, variant spellings of his last name include Eymerich, Eymerich, and Eymericus. Literary character. Valerio Evangelista, an Italian novelist, has written a cycle of 10 science fiction books featuring Eymerich as the main character. There is also a French comic book series on Eymerich, which is an adaptation of Evangelista's novels. Eymerich is also one of the main antagonists in the novel Cathedral of the Sea by Ildefonso Falconer.